the webinar. For those of you that are just joining in, this is the first webinar that Heather Hansen Presents is putting on, hopefully not the last. I hope that you feel like you get a lot out of it so that together we can help you to make better choices and better decisions. You're making decisions every day. You're choosing things like who you're going to give power to, whether that be your children, your spouse, your employees, your employers, all of those things. You're going to be choosing who to engage with, whether that's business partners, friends, colleagues, people that you just meet every day. You're choosing who you're going to date or who you're going to love. And you're choosing who you're going to trust, whether that be a babysitter, a family member, someone at work, a potential client. All of those choices have a huge impact on the outcome of your life and how happy you are. Alan and I spend our lives choosing jurors, the people that will sit in those chairs that you see there and make huge, impactful decisions about the fates of our clients. But you fill that jury box as well. You fill it maybe with 5 friends and 3 colleagues at work. You fill it with a partner, you fill it with a babysitter, you fill it with a dog walker, you fill it with a lawyer, a doctor. You also fill it with the best version you want to choose as well. So we want to help you fill your jury box today. We're hoping to give you just some of the tips and tricks that we've learned in order to help you to do that. Alan is my co-host. Alan, you just went black on me, but maybe other people can see you. Let me know, guys, if you can't see Alan. Alan is the principal and owner of Trial Methods. He has spent 18 years helping lawyers choose juries. If you watch that show Bull, then you know what Alan does. That's pretty much what he does. He works with lawyers, not only in choosing juries, but also in doing things like choosing how to address witnesses. Alan, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can see me, but I can't see you. It's the flip-flop probably on the squares on the left.
Yeah, same thing is happening here. But Alan, you have a degree in psychology and law, correct?
Correct.
And as far as, not only do you help lawyers choose juries, but what other things do you help them to choose?
A lot of it is to help them navigate the psychology of trials. So understanding how jurors make decisions, but also once the jurors are seated, what is the best way to present your case that's going to resonate with those jurors? How do you connect with jurors? And that also entails prepping witnesses properly, crafting arguments, and then ultimately helping them with their case presentation at trial and how things are going to resonate.
Yeah, I for a minute I just went out, so I had to rework here. Hopefully that's not going to keep happening, but Bonnie, keep letting me know if it does, and we'll just keep working on it. In the meantime, Alan's got a degree in psychology and a degree in law, which is going to be a big part of what we discuss here today. I have 21 years experience trying cases, choosing juries. I also have a psychology degree and a huge interest in how we can learn a little bit more about ourselves to make our lives a little bit better. And the number one thing, the number one tip that we have for you guys today is to choose. To just make decisions and take that step. So many of us are afraid to choose. And Alan and I are lucky because we don't have a choice. In our jobs, we have to choose, we have to pick juries, and we can't wait forever to do it. I know a lot of you said in the poll that one of your biggest concerns is analysis paralysis. This idea that, oh gosh, is this choice better or is this choice better? And the truth is that's normal. So you see here, we always think about those things that if you're in a moment of fear, do you fight or do you flight? Do you take off? But in truth, psychology shows that it's actually fight, fear, or freeze. If you've ever been driving down the road and you see a squirrel who like darts in the middle of the road and then sort of just stands there in the middle of the road, not sure what to do next as the car is bearing down, that's freeze. I know that's what I do in moments of fear. I tend to freeze rather than to move or rather than to act. And you don't want to freeze when it comes to decisions. You want to actually act. And the more that you act, the better that you get at acting. Alan, do you find that with the lawyers you work with, the more juries they've chosen, the more confident they are in the choices, and therefore the easier they find it to be?
I think that's true. The more they do it, the better at it. Just like anything else, repetition helps. And so you have a lot of attorneys who want to fight. They're going to take this to trial. They're not going to settle. Other ones a little more interested in settling. They don't have that fight. And the interesting part is where you have the freeze part, and then it's what do you do with that? But it does happen, and I think it's less likely to happen the more experience the attorneys have.
So believe it or not, guys, as much as you feel like I don't have the right information, I'm not sure what to choose, all of the experts in books like The CEO Next Door, which we're going to talk about in a minute, in books like Hunch and Blink, all of the research shows that the more decisions you make, the better you are at making decisions. So perhaps the best thing for you to do to overcome analysis paralysis is to make more decisions, to have a little bit more confidence in yourself and your decision-making abilities. In this book, The CEO Next Door, which I recently read, they talk about what makes a good CEO. And they say that decisive CEOs, those who are willing to make decisions quickly and confidently, are 12 times more likely to be high performers. As an aside, this is a book I read as part of the Next Big Idea book club. And if you like this kind of thing, I highly recommend that book club. They provide the books. They provide a fabulous Facebook page for everyone to interact. And they provide access to the authors to talk about the books. And in this book, they talk about the fact that decisive CEOs are 12 times more likely to be high performers, but that doesn't mean their decisions are always right, guys. It just means that they're willing to decide, and if they're wrong, they make a new decision. So I don't want you to think that these big CEOs who are running multi-million-dollar companies know something better than you. See, Laura's a member of, she's in the chat room saying she's a member of the club. Fabulous books, fabulous insight. And this book I learned a lot from, because I learned that CEOs are decisive, they make decisions, and they're often wrong. And when they're wrong, they just make a new decision, but they're comfortable with uncertainty. And Alan, I know that lawyers are not that comfortable with uncertainty. How do you deal with that when you're working with lawyers?
Well, a lot of it is just telling them, look, you're going to get experience doing something, but you have to do it. Now, when it comes to jury selection, lawyers will say that talking to jurors, getting them to talk, listening, all the skills that they're used to and what they like about litigation doesn't translate well into a good voir dire, a good jury selection process. Attorneys are taught to control the situation, to do a lot of talking, make sure you don't ask a question you don't know the answer to, but in voir dire, I tell them you got to completely reverse that. Pretend you're at a social setting, having a cocktail, having hors d'oeuvres with people where you want to interact, you want to empower others to talk, you really want to learn about others and get them to talk. And with time, and it also relates to the other slide, the best attorneys are the ones that will realize they made mistakes and will learn from them. So a fear of a mistake is really something that you try not to have in your thought process, because the good attorneys will make mistakes and learn from them, which goes to your point about having more experience, makes you more easily able to make a decision.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as lawyers choosing jurors, we don't get to undo that choice. So oftentimes in life, you do get to make a new choice. We don't. And yet we have no choice but to make those decisions and then live with them. And so you have to have the confidence in yourself to know that you can live with the decisions you make. One of the quotes that I enjoy is that if you don't like somewhere that you're at, you can leave. You're not a tree. And we don't have to stay where we are. We don't have to stay with the decisions we've made. And if we do, and there are of course situations where we do, you can change your mind. The other thing that I found was fascinating from the book, The CEO Next Door, the research they did showed that the smarter someone is, the less decisive they are. And that's because they think about that analysis paralysis that so many of you said was an issue for you in the poll. That's what they do. They analyze every decision, they analyze every option, they overthink it. And sometimes it's the people who aren't that smart, book smart, but are better at making quick decisions and having confidence in those decisions that are able to actually succeed. So sometimes you want to put off your thinking cap and put on your confidence cap in order to make these decisions work for you. The other piece, and Alan, I want to talk to you about this because the book, The CEO Next Door, recommends that you give others a voice, but not a vote. Alan, how does that work for you in your practice with helping lawyers choose juries and everyone sort of wants to have their input?
Right. Well, the main thing I tell lawyers when they're talking to juries is that you don't want to come off as condescending. You don't want to come off as telling the jury what to think. You don't want to get up in front of a jury and say, here's what you have to believe. This is the conclusion you have to reach. You want to empower them to do that. You want to have them connect the dots. They're the ones that are obviously going to render a decision that affects the client. but you don't want to come off as being too lecturing. And that applies in everyday life. If you think about the people that we surround ourselves with, do we rather hang out with people that are telling us what to do and pointing out directions, or saying, well, if you do it this way, then I think you're going to see X, Y, Z. So I think that's a nice little illustration of how what happens in real life also matches what happens in jury selection.
Yeah, it's this give a voice, not a vote was fascinating to me, because we do tend to give everyone in our lives a vote. And sometimes they get a vote. You know, if you're in a family and you have a spouse and you're going on a vacation or you're planning something for your family, of course your spouse gets a vote. But when it comes to the decisions that impact you, those inner decisions that are most important, you can give everyone else a voice, but you have to have confidence in yourself to know that the only vote you need is your own. And as a sort of an aside, but something that I think is important to note, sometimes the inner voices, the fear is the voice that speaks loudest. Elizabeth Gilbert, who's the author of Eat, Pray, Love, and Big Magic, and a lot of other books, talks about this. And she's talking about going on a car ride with her fear and her hope and her joy and her options. And she says that fear can come on the ride, but it doesn't get to drive. And so all these other people can have a voice, and certainly you want to hear their voices, but you are the ones who are going to actually make those decisions. So the first tip, to recap, is choose. If you leave this webinar with nothing else but the confidence to make choices, knowing that it's okay, I will feel like I have done my job here, and that Alan and I, the work that we put into this works, because choosing is really the number one thing. The next thing, though, I think is what many of you are interested in here, and it's something that, again, we could talk about forever. And if you're interested in a deeper dive, we can talk about that later. But this is knowing the language. And knowing the language means knowing not only the words that we all use, but body language, tone, and micro expressions. So let's go through each one of those quickly. Micro expressions are those little movements on your face that you don't even know you're making, like a raise of an eyebrow or a snarl, but that other people see and actually connect with. Alan, is that something that you're noting when you're looking at potential jurors with the lawyers? Are you actually trying to hone in on micro expressions?
It's something that if it happens and you notice it, it's good information. It happens so fast and it's hard to see that it's not something that any kind of strategy or analysis is built around, but the more information, the better. So if a lawyer asks a question, you see a juror slightly wince or move their face in a certain way or do anything, then you can infer how that juror is not only reacting to your question, but how they're going to view the case as it proceeds.
Right. And I think, micro expressions, as you said, there's whole books on micro expressions. They're so small that it's really hard to note them. But tone and body language are much more important. I'm seeing questions come up in the chat room. Put your questions under the question so that we remember to get to them at the end, because we don't want to miss a single one of your questions. Tone is something we're going to talk about in just a minute. But right now we're going to address body language in general. So body language is something that is huge. And there's so much to be gleaned from body language. So if you're sitting down to interview a babysitter or a nanny or a potential employee, or if you're interviewing for a job, there's a lot you can learn from people's body language. The first thing, though, that you have to know is that you cannot be looking down. All of these people taking notes are therefore not seeing the body language that might be giving them the information they need. So, Alan, when you're doing jury selection, do you take notes, or do you spend the time that would be spent taking notes actually connecting and watching the potential jurors to make sure that you're not missing something like a cross of the arms? And we'll talk about the different things that you might miss. But are you taking notes, or do you wait until they've left the room?
My notes are just very concise. They're very bullet point, because I spend most of my time watching the jurors, observing them, even when, in terms of nonverbal communication, even when you're doing nothing, you're communicating. So even when you're sleeping, you're communicating. I've heard that. That's not my line, but somebody else said that. So I don't want to get caught up in note taking, because I will miss something. If I'm writing something down, I'm looking at it and I'm missing what a juror might be saying. I might be missing a nonverbal. I'm going to miss some body language, what jurors or potential jurors do with their hands, with their head, everything, the way they sit is something I would rather see and know and remember than something that I would write down.
How do you feel about phones, Alan? Do you prefer that the lawyers you work with don't bring their phones in for voir dire, or are you in courtrooms where the judges won't allow them anyway? How do you feel about phones as a distraction from body language?
even for attorneys who are good at not checking their phones, just having it present, I think, is a distraction. And I've seen studies about that recently, where if a phone is within a 3 foot vicinity, your cognitive abilities are somewhat impaired. So it's not my biggest battle, because here, if I'm hired by an attorney, some might not like me forcefully telling them, check your phones at the door when the bailiff says it's okay, or the judge says it's okay. But I do recommend that. I say, you know what, I'd shut your phone off, keep it away from you, have somebody else look at it, check it on a break, but have this kind of psychological barrier between you and your phone. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, when your head's down, you're missing things. And that's why I have this $58 versus $95. So in this book, Hunch by Bonnie Jiwa, I think is her last name. And if you guys want any of these book citations, I'll send them out to you in the future. But Hunch talked about this man who was a money hunter. He used to walk the streets of New York City looking for drop change. And prior to 2006, he would make about $58 a year doing that. And after 2006, he started making $95 a year. The difference between those two times was the invention and the use of the iPhone. Now, more and more people are looking at their phones and not paying attention to whether or not they're dropping money. And if you're looking at your phone, you're missing body language. If you're looking down, you're not seeing what's going on. Although I can tell you that many body language experts say that the honesty of your body reduces as you move up the body. So the most honest part of your body language, they say, and this is from books that I highly recommend, like What Everybody Knows by Joe Navarro and Captivate by Vanessa Von Edwards. These books are all about body language. So if this is something that intrigues you, you should get those books for sure. They talk about how your feet are the best indicators of how you actually feel. So if someone's feet are turned towards you, chances are they're interested in the conversation that you're having. If they're turned away, body language experts say, they're on their way out the door. If their legs are going, that can be a sign of two things, either nerves or excitement and happiness. And so that's something too that body language experts say that you should be paying attention to, the feet and the legs. And then as you move up the body, you can talk about different things that are important. Hands are huge. Hand motions are huge, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But before we get there, Alan, I want to talk to you. Do you note jurors' legs movements and their feet, or is that something that you're less focused on than their hands and arms and faces?
More focused on the hands, the arms, and faces. A lot of it is just because I don't get to see their feet. Now, when a juror's sitting in the box or in the gallery, I can't see their feet. Now, when they get up and walk, especially, I don't know, the more I talk to you and the more I learn about this, the more in the future I'm going to look at the feet. But for me, it's mostly the hands, the arms, things that are visible. But my main mantra is that any information is good information. So anything that I can observe and then assimilate that into my assessment, I think that's good to know.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more in a couple minutes about feet and walking, because that's a different thing as well. But this is important. And Bonnie, my fabulous assistant who helped me hook up all this webinar stuff and make it all work, she had a really good point that I wanted to make sure we covered. And that is that many of us now are talking to people and interviewing people through this, through webinars, through Skype, through Zoom, through Google Hangout, and we're talking to each other this way. And does body language really matter? Well, studies show that it does. It does matter, but it matters in a different way. So one of the things that you want to do when you're talking this way is you don't get the opportunity to do a handshake. So the initial introduction, the nod that you give, and the eye contact that you keep with the camera can be really important in the way that the other person receives you. So there's two ways to look at this. If you're the one doing the deciding and you're talking to someone who's not making eye contact with you in the camera, you may want to realize that that is making you inherently biased against that person. And it might be a bias that doesn't serve you. You know, so many times with things like body language, it all depends on context. If the person that you're interviewing is not used to talking on Skype, not comfortable with it, not comfortable with this type of interaction, they may spend the whole time looking down at their keyboard or looking at their notes and kind of forget that you're there. it's important to realize that you're naturally going to be biased against that person. So they could have fabulous resume, fabulous way with children, say, or if it's a dog walker, they could be fabulous with pets. If it's a potential colleague or employee, they could have a fabulous way to bring in something to your business. And yet you might be so biased against them because of the fact that they're not making eye contact with the camera that you sort of put them out of the running. So that's a bias that you want to be aware of. If you're on the other end of that conversation, you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward by looking into the camera, nodding as a hello, using your hands a little bit, and really engaging. For the hand thing, and Alan, I want to talk to you about this because it's interesting. This number, these 272 versus 465, these are numbers I got from that book, Captivate by Vanessa Van Edwards. She looked at TED Talks. And TED Talks are these talks that people give that are 18 minutes long, that are uploaded millions of times and watched millions of times across the world. And she looked at some of the most popular TED Talks on leadership. And she found that of those talks on leadership, the 10 that were viewed the least often versus the 10 that were viewed the most often had one huge difference. The ones that were viewed the least often, the people who were speaking only used hand motions 272 times. But the ones that were used the most often used hand motions 465 times. Now I'm all self-conscious about the way I'm moving my hands. I don't want to keep them down. Hands are super important. Your natural bias, your natural survival instinct is to trust people who show you their hands. This goes back to our lizard brain, our survival instincts, that if someone is showing you their hands, it means they're not holding a weapon. So there's two ways to look at this as well. You want to make sure that you are not letting that bias you against someone who may be self-consciously putting their hands in their pockets, but also you want to be sure that you are using your hands and letting your hands be seen when you're interacting with someone. Alan, do you make it a point to talk to lawyers about using their hands? Or if you're doing a witness prep, is that something that you tell witnesses is important?
Definitely. A lot of times if I record an attorney doing a mock opening statement or a witness, that's one of the first things they'll notice when they watch themselves if they're not using their hands. So a lot of times they'll discover it on their own, but there's a lot of research to suggest that jurors will start to attribute negative traits with people who are not showing their hands. They think that if you're hiding your hands, you must be hiding something, or maybe you're not truthful, or maybe not seeing your hands means that you're not revealing certain things. So I don't want somebody to overcompensate and then start doing it unnaturally. And of course, when you think about it, you tend to do it. But if somebody's not using their hands at all, then I say that's something that definitely has to be worked on, because you're more trustworthy and likable and seem more competent when you use your hands.
Yeah, so Joe Navarro in this book, What Everybody is Saying, he actually did a whole bunch of polls that show that jurors, even if you're just putting your hands under the table, say on your lap, and not on the table, it's something that they at least subconsciously know. But to your point about overcompensating, it's funny because the last trial that I had, I told one of my witnesses about that TED Talk study, and that the ones that are most viewed and most liked had almost double the amount of hand motions. And he took that to heart, and during the testimony was really flailing with his hands a little bit, which went fine. He did well and everything was fine, but he hit the microphone. So you can overcompensate if you're trying. And that's, I think the reason we have this slide is that the hands up is to show that, I have no weapons. But one of the things that you have to remember anytime you're using body language to choose people is to put it in context. And so a lot of times it takes time to know how someone is with their body language. Christine, I think you're on here and you have different body language. I don't think you use your hands as often as I do. And I know that about you. I know about your body language. So I wouldn't read into that the same way as I would with someone I've just met. So the longer that you know someone and the more that you interact with them, the more that you can read their body language well. Even if you're just meeting someone, though, it's important to remember that your natural biases are going to come into play. And as much as you can recognize those, you can try to control them. The next thing that Alan and I wanted to talk to you about is avoiding assumptions, because we all do it. We all tend to think that you can read a book by its cover, and yet chances are you can't. For example, there's a study, again from the book Captivate by Vanessa Van Edwards, that said that we are more likely to want to help people who are dressed like us. Alan, do you find that your lawyers tend to gravitate towards people who are dressed professionally for their jurors?
I think, yeah, most lawyers believe in their cases. And so they think, oh, you know what, if somebody's dresses well, if they dress like me, if they're similar, then they must see the case like me. And if somebody dresses in a way that's markedly different, they might tend to say, let's give this guy an extra look, or why does she look so different and so casual? Now, keep in mind it's a courtroom setting, so most people are maybe supposed to or encouraged to dress up a little bit. But yeah, I think that just like in real life, when attorneys are looking at jurors, it's somebody that seems to have something in common with them, even if it's just clothes, might make an attorney more comfortable seating them on a jury, or at least being positively disposed to that person.
Yeah, and again, the thing that's interesting about this is the biases that it brings. So this is an unconscious bias, and it's something that you can't completely overcome. We all have them, and they're difficult to overcome. But if you're aware of it, you can at least tune into it and say, am I choosing this babysitter because she's dressed the same as I am? Or is it because she has good credentials, a good way with children, and my kids really like her? You know, and again, from this book, Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, which I highly recommend all of his books. If you're a member of the Next Big Idea book club, you know he's one of the curators. In the book Blink, he talks about, for orchestras, they used to have people try out to play in an orchestra on the stage. But then later on, they found that if they put people behind a screen, they were getting different decisions on those people. And it ended up being oftentimes sexist or racist decisions. But those are natural biases that people have. And so a lot of times, and we're going to talk about blindfolds in just a couple of minutes, but a lot of times wearing a blindfold, or at least closing your eyes in a figurative way, may help you make better decisions. So that is an important thing to remember, that biases are real, and judging a book by its cover is real. The other thing that's important to know is that confidence can fool you. It's more important than skill, reputation, and history with the person in order to gain their trust. So that's a really important thing to remember from both sides. Again, if you want to be the one that's being chosen, you want to come across as confident as you possibly can. But more importantly, for purposes of this webinar, if you are doing the choosing, you want to make sure that someone's confidence isn't blinding you to their perhaps lack of skill, lack of reputation, or lack of history with you. Alan, how does this play into your role with helping to choose jurors and helping lawyers to prep witnesses?
Certainly, confidence is one of the qualities that jurors cite as what they most remember about a witness. So there are many times where one of my clients will have a reputable witness that has been in the field for a long time, very smart, all the fancy degrees, and they testify, versus somebody that doesn't match that level of success, but they're confident. And it's usually the witnesses who are confident that the jurors remember. Talking to them after trial, a lot of the testimony tends to blur, but when I get a little more specific, if I mention names, it's usually that one witness that gets out there and is really confident, is self-assured, is decisive. Those are the ones that jurors remember.
Right, and that's a natural bias. So you can use that bias and present yourself as confident as you can be, and that actually is going to be a huge help to you in getting jobs and having people trust you. But on the other side, we need to be careful not to let someone's confidence rule the day. And the more you know, the better you are. You know better, do better. And so for those of you that are here thinking, well, I want to be better at choosing colleagues, babysitters, dog sitters, remember to put as much weight into their skill, their reputation, their references as you do into the confident swagger and the confident way that they approach you, because that definitely makes a difference. It looks like for those in the chat room that are still signed in as Bonnie, don't sweat it this time. We'll fix it for the next one. If you want to make a comment or a chat, just put your name first and I'll be sure to know who it is. Patty, I know that you're frustrated that you can't change your name, but we'll get it so that you can next time around. Now, this is an important point, guys, because a lot of you in the poll said that this is something that you really wanted to talk about. And this is where I'm going to embarrass myself most in this entire webinar, hopefully. It's conscious embarrassment as opposed to unconscious embarrassment, because in talking about perspective, I cannot overstate the role of the curse of knowledge. So I'm asking for you chatters to answer me now. What is it that I'm humming? Anyone know what I was just humming? I'm going to wait for your answers because I just hummed like a dork. So I need you to answer. Or if you don't know, type that into the chat room as well. If you don't know, look, Kirk, yes. Oh gosh, a lot of you know. Okay, so that's great. That's Name That Tune, obviously. The thing about Name That Tune is that for the hummer, it's frustrating because they know the song. And so when people don't know, when they can't guess it, they don't understand why they can't guess it. Why aren't they getting this song? It's so obvious. The hummer has the curse of knowledge. The hummer knows things that they can't unknow. And because of that, they're unable to communicate in the same way. So you know things that other people don't know. You have the curse of knowledge. And in having the curse of knowledge, it makes it difficult for you to put yourself in other people's perspective. Alan, I know you see this all the time with lawyers and how well they know their case. What do you do to overcome that?
A lot of it is just reminding them that the jurors are going to show up. They're lay people. They're not lawyers. They're not experts. They know nothing about your case. And these attorneys have been kicking it around for sometimes years and years. So it's trying to strike the right balance between not sounding condescending, but also you don't want to just talk right over their heads. You really have to impart that knowledge onto them and get in their shoes and see things from their perspective. And then you try to empower them with facts, with information, so they can do the same. And it's same thing with, by the way, so we did this in a practice, this when Heather hummed the tune. It took me a couple rounds to get it. And of course, when you did it now, this time, I knew it was coming. So I had the knowledge, it was easier. I could have said that right away, and I think I would have if I didn't know it. But even if you're, I was just thinking about this, you were talking about hiring a dog walker. When you hire a dog walker or babysitter or whatever, you know your dog, you know your kids. So when you're interviewing somebody, you might lose sight of that. And you might think that the person you're interviewing knows all that, but they don't. So you really have to, bit by bit, empower them and reveal the information they're going to need, because you have so much more of it. And like the slide says, that can be a curse.
Yeah, and the great way to overcome this is to ask questions. You know, one of the things that's frustrating for me as a trial attorney is I don't get to ask the jury, do you get it? Or does this make sense to you? Or do I have the curse of knowledge? Am I not communicating clearly? And in jury selection, you get to ask questions. So you get to choose better by asking questions. And we're going to talk a little bit longer about asking questions. But I think the best way to get other people's perspective is to ask questions. There's actually studies that show this. Adam Grant just tweeted, I think yesterday, a bunch of studies that show that the way to get another person's perspective is not imagining what it must be like to be them, but actually asking what it's like to be them. And that's really important. And it's especially important for trial attorneys. A trial book that I read said that if you say a word during your opening, your closing, or your examination that the jury doesn't understand, they don't even hear the next 7 words you say. The brain is so busy trying to understand that word that they don't hear the next 7 words you say. And now I've done some television the past few years, and that has definitely made me better as a lawyer, because I'm able to remember to use words that hopefully everyone will understand. And so gaining perspective of the people that you might be choosing is an integral part of that choice. And then you gain perspective, and then you make a choice. And if the choice is a wrong one, you make a new choice. We go back to that first point again and again, that the importance is in choosing. The next thing, of course, is asking questions. And it's something that I'm a little bit obsessed with, since my job is to ask questions. Alan, how much do you focus on asking questions when you're working with the lawyers before the jurors come in? How do you hone those questions?
Well, I think you just have to be really aware of where they're coming from. Again, it's just about perspective taking, and you want to ask questions. The last thing an attorney wants, and this goes for real life too, you don't want to ask somebody a question that the recipient doesn't understand. You'll just get a blank stare, and that's what I try to work on with attorneys in voir dire. You don't want an attorney asking a convoluted question, or asking a question that doesn't apply to the case, or asking maybe even a real personal question before the jury was warmed up. So it's really important to stick with the basics, and also you have to gauge your audience so you know what type of question you can ask, what words you want to use, and what the best way is to phrase a question so you don't have just a bunch of blank stares.
And there's so many personality models out there, and I love this stuff. So I take all the tests and what's my personality type. But time and time again, researchers have found that this 5-factor personality test or evaluation is the most accurate in determining someone's personality. And the 5 factors, they spell out ocean. And this is the way I remember it. I got that specific mnemonic from Captivate by Vanessa Van Edwards, but it's the 5-factor personality test is out there everywhere. And the 5 factors are openness, and then the opposite, of course, is closedness, conscientiousness, extrovert versus an introvert, agreeable versus disagreeable, and neurotic. And those 5 things are things that you can sort of eke out through questions and through observing body language and through the different conversations that you're having to get other people's perspective. So you may want to, before you have to choose something, whether it's a babysitter, a dog walker, a colleague, a friend, whether you're going to swipe right or swipe left on someone if you're looking into dating, you might want to decide which of these things is most important to you, and then try to ask questions that will sort of bring out those things. I will make a self-deprecating note that one of the things that they say is that for people who tend to have a lot of positive quotes on their walls, and if anyone follows me on social media, you know that I put up a lot of positive quotes. They say that we tend to be neurotic, and it's self-soothing for us to put those types of quotes up there for what it's worth. But there are certain things that you can do to read how someone is with those 5 personality factors. The biggest one is a big smile in interaction. So a natural smile. Those types of people are usually extroverted. So if you're looking for a babysitter, that might not be that important. But if you're looking for a salesperson, it might be vital to have someone who's extroverted. Another thing is watching the way that a person walks, because if a person walks in a very relaxed manner, studies show that that person tends to be more agreeable. Whereas if they walk in a more stilted manner or with a hunched up shoulders and short steps, they tend to be disagreeable. So these are the types of things that you might want to pay attention to. Alan, we talked about body language earlier. If you have the opportunity to watch jurors, is that something that you do?
Yeah, I think it's just a part of the big picture, and it shows a comfort level. People who are comfortable with themselves, and they'll probably tend to be more comfortable in a social setting, which in a case of a jury is deliberation. So people who walk maybe a little uptight or rigid, it might suggest that they're not so comfortable with themselves. They're going to be a little more standoffish and rigid during the deliberation process, which is ultimately what you want to gain insight into.
And that's a really good point. I know we're going to talk about envisioning the future in a couple minutes, but as far as extroversion, do you want extroverted jurors, or are you afraid that they may try to take over the process? I know that for us, you only want an extroverted juror if they're on your side.
Right, that's pretty much it. I would say the same thing. If you have an extrovert who people are going to like, you just have to make sure that they're going to see the case the way you want to see it, because if they're against you, then they're going to turn off other jurors in the other direction.
Yeah, another book that I read a lot about these 5 personality factors was in Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And his most recent podcast, I think it's his most recent podcast, it's about pulling the goalie. I highly, highly recommend that podcast. His podcast is called Revisionist History. And that one talks about these 5 personality factors. And he talks about how you can know someone for years and years and years and years and years. And yet research shows that people who don't know that person at all may better assess those 5 personality factors by looking in their medicine cabinet. the way that they keep it, whether it's all super organized or whether it's sort of a mess. All of those types of things may be able to tell you more about someone than knowing them years and years and years, which goes back to, I think it was the real Bonnie who made this point. Someone signed in as Bonnie, talked about the first impressions tend to be wrong. First impressions in general tend to be right. There's a lot of studies out there. Wendy Levinson did studies on doctors, and first impressions of doctors tends to predict whether or not they're going to be sued. So a lot of times you want to really look into whether your first impressions are wrong or whether you just think they're wrong, because you should trust yourself, trust your instincts, trust your intuition, and trust your first impressions, because a lot of times studies show they might actually be right. Now we want to talk about listening. And Alan, I know that this is a problem that you have with lawyers. Tell us about the importance of listening and choosing and what lawyers do wrong.
Well, did you know, Heather, lawyers like to talk?
I've heard
Yeah.
that that's true. I was listening when someone said that we like to talk.
Yes, right. That's true. You were listening. And so not to put this to you specifically, but just lawyers in general and I think a lot of it is people who like to talk end up going to law school because they like to talk and they like to control a situation. They like their voice to be heard, and attorneys have a really tough time shutting that off. And when you pick a jury, you want to empower the potential jurors to talk because you want to listen to what they have to say. So I tell my clients, when you're doing voir dire for 3/4 of the time, you should be listening. You want to ask the right questions, some of them targeted, some of them very general to get them to open up a little, but overall, about a quarter of the time, you should be talking. And that's very hard for attorneys, but it leads to the most effective voir dire because then you know the most about your panel that you possibly can.
Yeah, and if you're asking questions and not listening to the answers, what good are the questions, right?
Right, and jurors pick up on that, just like in real life. If you're having a conversation with somebody on the street and you ask a question and then you're not listening because you're thinking of your next question, I think that's, people pick up on that. Whenever you interact with someone, you really want to not just look like you're listening, but actually listening, because that's easy for people to discern.
Yeah, and when you're choosing people for anything in your lives, whether it be people that you're going to have as friends, people that you're going to have as colleagues, and people you're going to hire for something, listening is imperative. And it's not only imperative because of the words they use, but also because of the tone that they use. You know, I do some consulting now, and in that consulting and in some of my keynotes, I have people put on blindfolds, because when you shut down the other senses, your ability to listen for tone gets better. And it could be, Alan, that you would be well served by making your lawyers wear blindfolds during jury selection, although the potential jurors might think that you're a little bit wacky. But it makes a huge difference, because studies show that you are better able to understand emotion through tone of voice than all 5 senses combined. That's important to repeat. All of your other senses combined aren't as good as listening to tone. That may mean, guys, that if you're interviewing someone, you might be better off doing that by phone than in person, because you can really hear whether they're condescending or angry or stressed or frightened. And this is a skill that is built. You know, when I work with call centers and when I work with people in call centers and we do the thing with the blindfold, they get the tone of voice right almost 100% of the time. Not only that, they think it's a silly exercise because they understand tone so well that it's that they don't even have to think about it. Lynn, you are absolutely right. When your parents say it's not what you say, it's how you said it. Alan, I know you have a good story for that happened to you just this weekend.
Yeah, so that was just, I was standing in line and it was just a question of who got there first. Well, I didn't want to just let it go, but I didn't want to be obnoxious either. So I tried to find the right tone. This was paying at a restaurant early in the morning. And I felt like using the right tone would convey the sense that, okay, I'll get my message across, but it's also, I'm not being confrontational. I'm not being obnoxious about it. So I struck the right tone where she saw that I was just pointing it out, maybe for the future. And it made all the difference. This woman apologized, and of course that's a whole nother topic, but the apology was readily accepted and we moved on. And it also made me, try saying, I tell people also, if you say to your dog doesn't know words, so say to your dog, bad dog. That's a really bad dog in a nice, positive, encouraging way. Of course, the dog's going to react to the tone and not to the words.
Yeah, I mean, tone is everything. There's so many studies about tone. I could go off on this. As I said, we can do a deeper dive on any of these topics if you guys want to. I know we're running short on time and I don't want to keep you from your day any more than I have to. But if you want to do a deeper dive, we could talk about tone forever because tone is so important. I thought this study was fascinating, and I'm going to talk to some female surgeons that I'm speaking to in August about this. Women's voices make plants grow better than men's. Now, Christine, I know you're watching and you are a gardener and you love to garden. And if you keep talking to your plants, they may grow faster. There was also a study, and it's sort of been questioned, so take it for what it's worth. But this famous Japanese scientist, and I don't remember his name off the tip of my tongue, but he did a study with water, and he spoke to some water with positive tones and positive words and other water with negative tones and negative words. And when they later looked at the water under a microscope, the water that had been spoken to with a positive tone looked different. Now, whether or not you believe that's true, these other studies are absolutely scientifically backed, and they show that the tone of voice you use is important. Lynn, your dad was right. The tone of voice is what matters. So when you're listening to someone in an interview, make sure that their tone, their audio is matching the video, because it can oftentimes use power poses before they get in there and use the right body language with you, but it's really hard to fake your tone of voice. Mm-hmm. So it's something that you can really hone into. Before I move on to the next topic, Alan, is there anything else you wanted to add on tone?
Sure, I would just say, and if you put yourselves in the seats of a juror, a lot of times witnesses are just shown deposition testimony. So you see a question, you see an answer, then the jury gets to read it or you look at it. It's completely different than seeing the actual witness testify because there's no tone. I mean, that's really the only difference. So hearing it is much different than reading it, because when you hear it, you get the tone.
Well, and that's, somebody just gave, I think it's Bonnie, or someone logged in as Bonnie. Masaru Emoto is the name of the scientist who studied the water crystals. Thank you, Bonnie. It's, jurors, when they are, that's one of the reasons that they're not allowed to look at their phones. And when they are, when their eyes are closed, I'm not always worried unless they're sleeping. Because if they're listening with their eyes closed, they're getting the tone of the witness. And that is really the most important thing. And that's what I always tell my clients before even depositions, that the tone is something that the jury and that the other people will remember long after they forget the words. So it's really a vital part of what we use to choose people. And then the last thing before we get to your questions is envisioning the future. And Alan, this was your point, and I think it's a fabulous one. So why don't you tell them what it is that they can do about envisioning the future that will help them to choose people in their lives?
Sure. It's basically envisioning when you're interacting with somebody and you think that person might be around regularly, permanently, or just any time in the future. When you're talking to them, you have to remember context, but you also want to think to yourself, how is this going to evolve into the future? And it obviously depends on the nature of the relationship. But with what I do with jury selection, hearing jurors talk, I think, okay, look at how this, listen to the words this juror is using, listen to how these jurors are responding to questions. I want to, in my mind, think, what's it going to look like when they're deliberating, when these points come across, they believe something and they're interacting with each other. How is that going to unfold? And I think a lot of that applies to just life in general. When you're interacting with somebody, when you're doing something with a person and you're thinking, I'm going to have some type of relationship with this person in the future, you have to ask yourself, what is it going to look like? And in the future, how is this person going to be in that situation?
Right, and there's a great book on that I think it's called Decide, but I know it's by Chip and Dan Heath, who are brothers who have written a bunch of great books. The Power of Moments is another. In their book Decide, they said that when you're trying to make decisions, you want to envision, as Alan said, what this decision will look like in 10 minutes, in 10 months, and in 10 years. And a lot of times in 10 years, the decision won't make that much of a difference, when maybe that's one of those decisions that you want to start your practice on. But in 10 minutes and in 10 months, things like who's going to take care of your kids, who's going to be walking your dog, who's going to be your colleague at work, who will you be working for? What will that look like in 10 months? When you're settled in and the glow of newness has worn off, are you still going to be happy with this decision? If you're choosing someone to date in 10 months, when the glow of new love has worn off, are you going to want to bring them around to your family and your friends? So envisioning the future is a huge way to help you to make better decisions. We really want to answer your questions. I see a couple of them in the question down at the bottom. If you have questions, bring them in, because I'm going to go down there in just a minute. But I wanted to just read something that I thought was I call them God winks. On my way here, I'm almost done with this book by Seth Godin, and I was reading it on the subway on the way here, and I'm almost done, as I said, and I'm on page, what page is this? 206. And Seth Godin is talking about Ashita Gupta. I don't know who that is, to be honest. But he says, Ashita Gupta wrote, "Every day is a new chance to choose. The power of choice is just that, power. The only thing we have to do is remember that we control the harnessing of that power. We choose." So guys, you have a huge amount of power in the choices that you make. And I hope if just a little bit, this gives you the confidence to make those choices, knowing that you can always choose again, and you can use the tips that we've shared to make some of those choices. I'm gonna, Bonnie, I will put that question in the questions, Bonnie. This is the information for Alan. If you want to stay connected with Alan, this is his Facebook page, his LinkedIn information, and his Twitter. Mine is here as well, but I'm gonna leave Alan's up on the screen a little bit so you can take a screenshot. You'll also get this entire webinar as a replay once it's, I don't know, like